Induced drag is a byproduct of lift. Wrong. If you or someone you know uses this sentence to explain the phenomenon of induced drag, then they are drastically incorrect. In this video, we will break down the aerodynamics associated with induced drag in a way that you will remember induced drag forever, for eternity. Aerodynamics is one of my favorite subjects to teach because I love creating the imagination that is required to learn aerodynamics. Aerodynamics has to be understood in an imaginative sense. You have to imagine the airflow. You have to imagine the angle of attack. You cannot see it, but you have to imagine it. And that's why it is one of my favorite subjects to teach. Let's get started. Induced drag, as the name suggests, is induced whenever angle of attack is increased to increase lift. This is not the same as saying it is a byproduct of lift generation, because you generate lift even when you increase velocity, but that does not increase induced drag. You should know this because lift can be increased using velocity according to this equation, but induced drag does not increase with increase in velocity according to this graph. Hence, saying that induced drag is always a byproduct of lift would be incorrect. So then what is induced drag and how is it created? Let's go to the overhead camera and do some drawing, some artistic work to understand this. Alright, so we are going to learn about induced drag using a bunch of airfoil diagrams. So let's say this is an airfoil. The relative wind is coming from here. The one thing that you need to remember from now is that lift, which acts from the center of lift, is always perpendicular to the relative wind. So the lift vector, the total lift, is always going to be perpendicular to the relative wind. When we are flying straight and level, cruising at about 100, relative wind is coming from here and our lift vector is pointing upwards. What happens when you reduce your airspeed or when you are performing a slow flight? What you do is you start increasing your angle of attack to increase the amount of lift to compensate for the reduced airflow, because when you slow down, airflow over the airfoil reduces, so you need to increase your angle of attack to compensate for the reduced amount of lift. That's what we do when we are flying a slow flight. Now we are at a higher angle of attack. We are still moving forward. Relative wind, the definition of relative wind is the wind acting parallel to the aircraft's flight path. So if aircraft is still moving forward, the relative wind should be coming from here. Okay, so relative wind is here and the lift vector would be perpendicular to the relative wind, as we have learned before. But this is not the case. What happens in this case is we are slow and we are at high angle of attacks. There are wingtip vortices which are generated at the wingtip. For those of you who don't know what wingtip vortices are, if this is the wingtip vortices come under and above from outside, and they are generating a spiraling movement of air behind the wing. So as the aircraft moves forward, a wingtip vortice is generated behind the aircraft, like you see in this diagram. This wingtip vortice is, if you can imagine, if this is the airflow, it's going to hit the airflow over here because air is coming over the wing. So wingtip vortices come over and hit the airflow here. If you take a look at this diagram, we know that this is the upwash, this is the downwash, and this is how the air is flowing, right? Yes, but when the wingtip vortices which hit the airflow behind the wing, which is somewhere here, push the downwash downwards, they deflect the flow of air a little more downwards or rearwards or backwards. They tilt the downwash, they push the downwash further down, creating an apparent flow of air which makes the airfoil feel as if the relative wind is coming from here. Relative wind coming from here will cause the lift vector to tilt a little back because, like we said, lift vector is always perpendicular to the relative wind. since we have a shift in the apparent relative wind like this, it shifted upwards, it tilted backwards. The lift vector, which was also perpendicular to the relative wind, moved backwards. This lift vector has two components. One, which is the rearward component, which you can see here. I didn't draw it exactly perpendicular, and the vertical component. Hold on, let me take different colored markers so that it is easier for us to understand. Okay, so I have two different colored markers. So the two components of the lift vector are the rearward component and the vertical component. So the total lift gets divided into a horizontal or the rearward component and a vertical component. Now if you take a look at the vector diagram of an aircraft, let's say that's an aircraft, a very stick figured aircraft. If you take a look at the vector diagram, we know that we have thrust, which acts forward, drag, which acts rearward, lift, that acts upward, and weight, that acts downward in a straight and level flight. If you can compare, you can see that the horizontal component of lift, because of the lift tilting backwards, is in the rearward direction. It adds to the drag, and this is induced drag. The vertical component is the lift, which opposes weight and keeps us in the air and helps us maintain altitude. But the rearward component, which is generated here, is what is induced drag. And that is why people say that induced drag is a byproduct of lift, but it is actually a byproduct of the angle of attack causing the apparent relative wind to shift upwards. And also, wingtip vortices play a big role in creating induced drag. Comment down below how wingtip vortices are changed in ground effect. So now before we go on to the front camera, let's summarize a few things here. The first thing we learned is that lift is always perpendicular to relative wind. Second thing we learned is at high angle of attacks, the relative wind is shifted because of the wingtip vortices pushing the downwash downwards. This was the downwash. This causes the rearward component of lift, which is what acts as induced drag. So this is the summary which we have learned. Relative wind, lift is always perpendicular to relative wind. When you are at angle of attacks, the total lift is tilted backwards because the apparent relative wind shifts, and the horizontal component of lift or the rearward component of lift acts rearward, making it the induced drag. Let's go back to the front camera. So you saw from the overhead camera that induced drag is created whenever angle of attack is increased and the apparent relative wind shifts upwards, causing the lift, which is always perpendicular to relative wind, to tilt backwards. Hence, the rearward component of the lift acts as drag, opposing the forward motion of the aircraft, hence acting as induced drag. This recap was just for you. So now that we know what induced drag is and how it is generated, let's take a look at 2-3 other important things. First, induced drag is created whenever the angle of attack is high. The three common reasons for high angle of attack are heavy aircraft, clean aircraft, which is not having any flaps that produce additional lift, and slow aircraft, since it requires higher angle of attack to create lift sufficient enough to keep it in air. Think slow flight. These three configurations, heavy, clean, and slow, are usually associated with high amounts of induced drag. Hello guys, before we go on to the second important thing, sorry for the break and the ad in between, but if you liked the way I explain and you want to learn aerodynamics properly, check out the link in description for a course on aerodynamics that I have made on my website. Let's carry on with the video now. Second, now let's take a look at this graph. This graph shows the relation between induced drag and airspeed. As we said before, slow speeds need more angle of attack and hence more induced drag, which is perfectly aligning with what the graph is showing. You can see at slower speeds, induced drag is higher, and at faster speeds, parasite drag is higher. Third, This graph would not apply when you are within half to full wingspan height of the ground, which means if your wingspan is 40 feet, if you are within 20 to 40 feet of the ground, this graph would not apply and induced drag would be minimum because of the ground effect. Now I'll make a separate video regarding ground effect, but you need to remember this. And if you want to learn about ground effect and follow the video that I make for ground effect, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell to get notified whenever I upload the next video. I hope you liked the video. If you learned something from it, please like the video and also comment down below what was the hardest concept of aerodynamics that you had learned and took a while for you to understand.